South Africa, the world's fourth biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions and whose exports include coal, says it will approach the European Union to discuss its planned tax on carbon-intensive imports, said it will hurt the economies of BRICS nations. Now, the EU's so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism, a tax on goods such as fertilizer, cement, iron, steel, and aluminium entering the bloc will fully kick off in 2026. Now, while this measure is meant to encourage companies to adopt better clean energy technology and discourage the production of such goods outside the EU, nations including South Africa argue it shifts the burden for climate action to poorer nations. Now, Clive Ramathibela-Smith, a senior executive partner, Hecare Capital and Partners, joins me to talk more about this. Thank you so much, Clive, for joining us.
Thank you very much, and an absolute pleasure.
Now, the European Union is planning to impose a tax on certain goods that are imported into the continent in order to encourage companies to produce them in ways that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's according to EU. So when I saw this report, the first question that came to me was that doesn't Europe itself produce goods in ways that even contributes more to carbon emissions? Or what's the deal here?
You know, I don't want to be very political. I might get into trouble. I'm on international television here. But let's put it to the basics. Obviously, we understand what industrialization is. The entire world has been fast moving towards renewable energy and alternative sources of power. What has been very, very encouraging to see is how South Africa has taken a stance towards this and actually made a pact and participated in the EU space in terms of making sure that they have deliberations. We are even in part and parcel of the Green Energy Act, which was signed with the United States and Europe, was reinstated by President Biden before when it was taken away by former President Trump. But here's the point. The point is, what is our contribution to the world that is in terms of CO2 emissions? It's very minute compared to the global spectrum. And part of the reason is, my brother, we are still a developing country compared to being a developed market. And so it seems like the guys that are already advanced in terms of development are prepared to sacrifice developing countries in order to serve a particular issue or a particular mandate. Now, I don't think anybody can disagree with the fact that we need to break down our carbon emissions. However, we have some of the biggest culprits still continuing to contribute quite significantly. And I just want to correct you there. I heard you say number fourth. No, we're actually 14th in the world. when you
No, I said 14th. I said 14th. Yeah.
Okay, you are forgiven. You are forgiven, my brother.
Go ahead, please.
So it's a challenge. It's a challenge. But the most important thing to note is even at the opening of Parliament, the seventh administration, President Cyril Ramaphosa mentioned our engagement with the EU, our engagement with the US to try and cut down on carbon emissions. It's not going to happen overnight because you know well, my brother, we are suffering here in South Africa with a serious issue of power and electricity. And so we've had to actually reopen some of those power stations that were decommissioned. They had to be recommissioned again in order to continue to sustain our national grid, to continue to support our neighboring countries in the SADC region so that they can be able to power their nation. So we have a responsibility both to remove ourselves and decrease the carbon emissions, however, continuing to support industry so that we don't have a declining economy, because even then we're in a worse situation than what we are currently.
Smith, Mr. Smith, I'm going to have to put you on a spot again. I understand how sensitive this is, but then let's look at the countries involved. We're looking at BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And we know the geopolitical tensions that have been going on all around the globe as regards certain issues along that line. Now, if we continue to have discussions like this as it affects climate change, carbon emissions, is it more about economic warfare than even trying to reduce carbon emissions?
There's two ways to look at it. The first one is each and every country who has a moral decree understands the importance of climate change and having an impact on making sure that it doesn't go any further, so that we can protect our children, our children's children, so that they have a brighter future. Nobody disputes that. But it will be even worse if, by cutting down or including these carbon emissions, particularly for EU, they have actually no right to speak. Um, Particularly in the EU, if we're going to cut down in emissions and it's going to become an economic burden on the developing market, so that we can not be able to expand, we cannot be able to grow, we cannot increase our performance in terms of our economic performance, we have a serious issue then. We have a problem. And your question, just to answer it directly, it is possible to have both questions answered yes. It's possible to have the same things simultaneously, to say this is the correct way to go. It is unfair, though, to expect a higher expectation from those countries that are just emerging, that are just developing, as this term goes, emerging markets, to perform at the same level as those countries that have already utilized those particular particles to get themselves to where they stand today as global powerhouses that have very strong economies, and their people are being fed, they've got enough power, they've got enough gas, and so you expect them to actually do better. We will not be able to be competitive if we do not actually address some of the developing structures that are in these countries, so that they can also be helped to grow and foster.
Now, this even coming amid the nation's plans to extend the life of its coal-fired plants so as to prevent a return of rolling blackouts. Now, this would cause a conflict and a setback for South Africa, I want to believe. So in that light, do you think that the BRICS could actually consider retaliatory tariffs, most especially for even South Africa? You know, retaliatory tariffs, probably trade restrictions, or exploring legal challenges, you know, whatever claims that can be put up alongside what the WTO rules specify?
We cannot work outside the WTO. It is near impossible because of the way that the bilateral agreements have been signed between all the countries that participate in our economic structure. And also, remember that these rules were put there together in order to control competitiveness and anti-competitiveness in the industry. And so it's going to be very difficult to act outside those rules. We can have a structure. I mean, you know that we've got AFTA here on the African continent. You just saw the delegation of the South African team coming back from the United States to go and renegotiate AGOA, so that it is both permanently structured, but also it expands to the rest of the African continent. We've also seen that there's been impact by the BRICS countries who have extended their mandate to other countries as well. And so they've become even more formidable and more powerful. So there is a story to be told between these two world powers. You're talking about the West and obviously the fast-growing East, which has combined itself with Africa as well. And so therefore, my concern is you don't want to create an economic war based on the fact that you are adjusting rules to suit certain other countries as opposed to others where they become excluded from participation. We have to understand that when we said we wanted global markets, when we wanted to become a global spectrum, a global economy, that means that you have to have all elements of the global spectrum included in your solution or in your development structures and development policy framework. Okay. And so the struggle is going to be who are you going to favor? And unfortunately, and I say unfortunately very cautiously, unfortunately, it seems there's a deliberate attempt to undermine these emerging markets and these emerging countries and these developing countries compared to what is happening in the traditionally Western countries and what's been happening there. These sanctions, these laws, these tariffs, additional costs that have been forced and pushed towards us are really, really unfair. And that creates that anti-competitism that we've been talking about that might create a global catastrophe, particularly for emerging markets like South Africa and the rest of the African continent.
Okay, so now that you've actually established the fact that this seems as a deliberate attempt to actually undermine emerging economies, now that would, in a way, mean that even investors who are hoping to tap into these resources in South Africa might be deterred. So are there alternative markets that South Africa can explore?
That's first thing that's a very good question. The first thing that you have to remember that African countries that include South Africa and Nigeria is doing relatively well in that market with the likes of the Dangote Group and all that. In South Africa, we have a highly concentrated market in the resources sector that is not beneficiated and doesn't grow internally. And that's the reason why things like AFTA are very important, because if you can create a way which a market like South Africa can trade more with Africa. Remember, from our GDP alone, only 7.5% comes directly from SADC and about 14% from the rest of Africa. We are not trading enough with one another. And that is the single biggest problem. And so it's difficult to get other markets. I'm just talking about home. I'm talking about you and I. So, yes, there are other markets externally. So, for example, there's China, which now is South Africa's second biggest trader on the market. They're competing there with the likes of the EU. And the only reason why China hasn't taken over the EU is simply because of the agricultural sector. And remember what's happening with the citrus story now with the EU and South Africa. So you can see, that's why I'm saying it's deliberate, because it seems like there's an attempt to try and make things much more difficult for developing markets like South Africa and the rest of the African continent to penetrate. But if we can trade a little bit more diversified, if we can work a little more collaboration and use the advantage of the agreement like AFTAs, for example, we have a better opportunity to do business without necessarily fighting off the rights to get ourselves to the EU. We do need to look after the environment, but it's far more important to have the economy running than to have anything else other than that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Clive Ramathibela-Smith, for sharing your thoughts with us on this.
I'm not a political analyst, my brother. Thank you.
Of course, I understand, but you actually did justice to it. Thank you.